Welcome to the second part of administering Azure virtual machines. Now in this part of the session, we'll start looking at how to connect to our virtual machines that we created in the first part and talk about the availability and scalability solutions within this. Let's get started. Now, let's jump back onto the portal and have a look at how to connect to the virtual machine that we just created. Now, in the portal, we are back on the page where we just created our app server 3, and currently it's running and ready to go. So what we can do is scroll down to the part in the blade on the virtual machine to say connect. Now, a few things that we'll need to understand, and depending on how we are connecting to this virtual machine. If I am going to use public IP address and RDP to connect into it, that could be one way for me to connect. Obviously, if it was a Linux machine, then instead of RDP, we'll be looking at port 22 for SSH to connect into it. But since this is a virtual machine running a Windows operating system, we'll use RDP as one of the way to connect to it. Now let's just check access to see can I currently connect to it. Now, typically, if you have security features added to this virtual machine, such as NSGs, then you might need to go and enable certain options within your NSGs. Currently, it suggests it's not accessible. So for me to do that, all I can do is go back into my network settings and check if everything seems okay within here. Now, scrolling further down, I can see there is an NSG rule that's applied on the subnet that we place this virtual machine in. So all I need to do is drop in a new rule. Now, configuring NSGs is something that we have covered in one of the previous modules. So in this case, all I'm going to do is simply jump in here and start going into adding a rule for RDP and simply allowing that rule. Now let's go and give it a priority number of 500 and simply add that rule. Now, once this rule is created, we can go back into the connect option and one more time check if everything seems okay for us to connect to this virtual machine. Now, while that checking is going on, what we can do to get ready on our machine, we can start an RDP connection and start typing in the public IP address. Now, it seems like the virtual machine is accessible, so all I'm going to do is copy that IP address and go into the RDP and type it in. By all means, if you want to download the file to copy it, that information is further down here, so you can download the RDP file, which will have the IP address already written into it, depending on how you like doing this. I'll hit connect, and this is where it should start connecting to that resource. Once it's happy for me to connect to this resource, what it should typically do is give me options to click on more choices, and I can then choose a different login account. This is where you'll type in the username and password that we created. And if I remember that correctly, it should simply connect through, telling me the certification that I can accept for it, and simply log me in to the virtual machine. Now, this is where my virtual machine is starting for the very first time in my environment. So this is me logging into that virtual machine for the first time. Now, as and when it's ready, log into that Windows machine or Windows 11 machine that we've just created. Now, this could be one way of connecting into your virtual machine environment. However, there are a couple of other things that we can add in as part of the security features. Things like considering to use just-in-time access at this point. Again, if, for instance, imagine this is my virtual machine that I'm connecting to, and this is part of a subnet, and that subnet belongs to a virtual network. And within this subnet, I have applied an NSG onto this at the subnet level. So if I'm working with that NSG right here, that traffic coming into that resource passes through the NSG and connects to that virtual machine. Now, opening the port 3389 onto this and assigning a public IP address to this machine simply means this machine is now currently advertised over the internet with its public IP address and the port that we've opened up. Now, leaving this open might not be as secure simply because anyone scanning through IP addresses and ports publicly open, they might find this resource and they can try logging into it, or at least make attempts to that. Now, to avoid some of these options, it's advisable that we go and configure things like just-in-time policy. That means I can have this port open as and when I need, rather than keeping it open all the time in my NSG rules. So something advised as part of the security features they can enable. Now, if you think you don't want to assign a public IP address to your virtual machine, and you don't want to configure ports onto your NSGs to allow access to your resource because this is not very secure for your environment, can we explore another way to connect to our resources? Well, we do have an option. Let's jump onto the slide and discuss Azure Bastion. Now, Azure Bastion is a solution that I can look into connecting to my virtual machine. Before we go and configure this, let's have a quick conversation on how it actually works. Now, this is a fully managed solution that's available for me to look at in my environment. Now, for me to work with this, all I need to do is enable this feature onto my environment. I have options to manually configure some of these settings, or I can let Azure choose those default settings for me and let it create that service for me. Like I said, it's fully managed. So things that are needed for the service, I don't need to worry about them. One of the key things that you'll have to understand is it will go and create a subnet inside of the virtual network that I am trying to connect to, or a resource like, for example, a virtual machine that I'm trying to connect to. It'll need its own subnet. The subnet name has to be written like so: Azure Bastion subnet. It cannot be anything else. And as part of that setup, it will simply create some other things in the backend, like a couple of NSGs to be applied in that environment. And I can use this Bastion service to connect to multiple resources in my environment. Now, a single Bastion service will allow me to connect to up to 50 virtual machines at a time. And that's a limitation on this service at the moment. However, these are not 50 concurrent sessions to a same virtual machine. I can use this service to connect to 50 different machines at a time. For a single virtual network, I only need one Azure Bastion service. I don't need more than one Bastion service. And that's more than enough. However, if I have resources spread on multiple virtual network, then I need a single Bastion service for every virtual network that I have. Apart from the exception that if I have created a VNet peer for this virtual network, then I can use that Bastion service to connect to all of the resources that are paired together. Now, how does it work once I've enabled this feature and configured it? Now, I have a virtual machine. In this case, I have three. I've got A, B, and C. So if I'm trying to connect to a virtual machine A in the setup, typically for a user to connect to it, one of the things that the user will have to do is log into the Azure portal. So that's one of the ways, or in fact, that's the way that you'll have to connect to it. Now, while you're doing that, obviously, you have to authenticate yourself to Entra and log into the portal securely. So it's a secure connection that you start off with. Once you're on the portal, you can then start looking at going to your Bastion service. The Bastion service typically would work with your secure protocols like HTTPS, running TLS over it. So there's transport layer security as part of that. So it's encrypted and secure connection that you form from your device on a browser, clicking or connecting to the Azure Bastion service. In the backend, when you try to connect to a machine, this service will use ports as a local environment from the service to the machine and connect, for instance, using 3389 or RDP to connect to a Windows machine. However, for me as a user, I simply see that machine opening up for me in a browser and brought back to me as a view in the browser. So this is going to bring me the virtual machine in a browser environment, and I can connect to it using a browser. Now, for this purpose, the virtual machine does not need to be advertised anywhere on the internet. In fact, it does not even need me to create a public IP address, so I can save on adding costs of multiple virtual machines with public IP address. However, the Bastion service requires a public IP for itself for it to work. I don't need to configure it. This is, again, like I said, a managed service, so any part of the service that it needs, they're already configured along with it. And one thing to bear in mind, this service doesn't come for free. So bear that in mind as you consider costs of adding this to your solutions. Now let's have a look at this in the portal. Now we're back into the virtual machine app server 3 that we were working on. Now, if I look into so far connecting to the machine using the connect option and considering using RDP, just underneath we have Bastion service option just to look there. Now, if I click on that, I get an option over here to suggest to find some details. Am I using English keyboard? I can choose different keyboards if I like. I can go in here and choose my authentication type. So am I using a password to it, or am I bringing a password from the key vault? Now, if I'm using a Linux machine, which I can do Bastion service for both of them. So the Bastion service in this case will allow me to bring the key for a Linux machine, but we'll go with the password. Now, so far, I haven't actually configured this service as part of the setup as yet. However, let's complete the details here and I'll show you what it will do. Now, if I do the password correctly, and then I scroll down to this, I'll ask it to open this in a new tab as a browser and work with me on that. And if I scroll further down, now the only thing is this part here, when I hit connect, it will start deploying the Bastion service for me for the first time. It's picking up some basic details automatically as part of the setup. If I need to go and configure them any different, I can go and choose configure manually and then go and define some changes to it. Like I said, it's a managed service, so I could get away with that, doing any of that if there was no need for me. Now, all I need to do is start connect or click on connect and it deploys, or I can simply deploy first and then connect. In this case, both will work. Let's hit connect. Now, as I see on the top, it's created the Bastion service for me, and straight away it's trying to connect to that virtual machine now in a browser view, and it's logging me in. Now, as we do this, my virtual machine that was logged in using the RDP connection, that's stopped. Obviously, you can't have multiple connections to the same machine, so that's stopped. And it's taken me back into the virtual machine for Windows 11 that we've got running in here. So this is very first time login. We didn't actually complete the login process on the RDP. We just logged in and we stopped at that point. Now this is my virtual machine running in a again a browser. Again, very seamless reaction to everything that you're doing. Super quick in you running things and doing things in this environment. So again, you can see it's nice way of working with your resources or connecting to a virtual machine using a browser and opening that in a browser mode. In this case, not advertising this to the world using public IP or leaving any ports open in my environment. And I'm back into a virtual machine. Right, let's get back onto the portal and let's stop talking about connecting to the virtual machines. Now this brings us to the end of connecting to virtual machines. Let's start talking about some other options that we haven't yet considered or discussed in detail. One of the first topics that I'm bringing into the conversation now is looking at availability, and we'll speak about scalability along with it. In fact, let's go into some of the slides and discuss them, and then we'll go back into the portal and have a quick look at them. Now, when we talk about looking at availability, you are talking about resources that we are configuring in the cloud. However, in the back end, we are still utilizing physical hardware. This hardware at some point would need either an upgrade or an update or some sort of maintenance to it. Either that's on a software level or hardware level. This could be planned or unplanned maintenance that's required for these resources. Now, while that's happening, we don't want our resources down or our connectivity to this resource down. We can pick from a couple of options to plan on how we can overcome some of these issues. First of all, let's have a look at one of the options called availability sets. Now, availability sets typically looks at creating my resources in multiple hardware as making it highly available for me. Now, just to explain this, let me jump onto a diagram that's listed over here to explain how imagine a typical network environment would look like. If I was to give you an example of a data center where you have multiple racks of data or multiple racks of servers connected, then it doesn't look anything like the diagram I have. However, you could imagine these two as two different racks that I am working with. Now, in a data center, you can have anywhere between 450,000 to 600,000 servers running and more. And they would need a lot of different racks to be hosted these on. And then you have racks for other services as well. So we can't start drawing them all out. We will be here for a whole day looking at some of those things. Just picking up two racks to start comparing or looking at this solution. Now, the availability set gives me options to look at creating my resources into multiple racks. So making sure that if I was to create two different virtual machines and assuming the likelihood of both of these machines falling on the same hardware, even though if we do some of the stats and look at the probability of that happening, might be very low. However, we want to ensure that doesn't happen in the back end, so we can start looking at creating what we refer as fault domains. In this case, that simply refers to a rack that has its own independent cooling, power, backup supply, networking connections, and all sorts of different things that you can imagine, as compared to another rack that's on a complete different fault domain. So if there was any issues to do with power, cooling, and networking, or any other issue hardware level, it doesn't impact other resources that are running. Now, if I was to create a resource, for my example, virtual machine, all I'll need to do is create them on at least two different fault domains. Typically, Azure offers me up to 3 fault domains that I can place these resources onto. However, we are placing just 2 for now in this example. So I'll place one of them in my fault domain 1, and I'll place the other one in fault domain 2. And again, if there was an issue with one of them, I should still have access to the other resource, so it becomes a little bit a bit more highly available for me. Apologies saying bit. It becomes highly available for me as compared to a single resource that could have higher chances of downtime in our environments. Now, if I consider bringing in the second option that I have on the screen, which refers to an update domain, you can imagine if we are looking at planned maintenance or just maintenance on its own for resources that are in our data centers in a region, then you can imagine that within a rack, we might not just want to go and switch an entire rack down and do the maintenance to it. Are this to do with physical changes to it, hardware level changes, or software level changes? We don't want to switch the entire rack down and start doing those changes. Now, on a single rack, you might have multiple servers connected to it. And what we would like to do on that is pick up resources that are configured within a rack on different update domains. For example, in this scenario, I have different virtual machines running on the same update domain. Now, I could have multiple update domains configured in my environment, so ensuring that if there was some sort of maintenance required and there was a need for them to turn down a resource, they will do them in one update domain at a time rather than taking the entire rack or entire set of resources away. Once they take one update domain down, they simply go and fix whatever they need to do and then bring it back to life. They typically wait for up to 30 minutes before they can start moving on to the next update domain to carry out their maintenance tasks. In this case, if I was to create a virtual machine that's plugged into update domain 1 and a virtual machine that was placed into an update domain 0, then the chances of both of them being turned off in the back end for planned or unplanned maintenance would be very less likely. And if I was to create them on separate fault domains, then chances of my entire resource or my solution, in this case a virtual machine, going down reduces. Now, earlier on in the virtual machine session, I mentioned that if I was to create a virtual machine using a premium disk, that gives me a service level agreement of roughly 99.9%. Again, this is my availability to it. However, now placing my resource into an availability set changes my SLA slightly higher to 99.95. Now, if you are interested to understand some of the details on how that change looks like, again, you can find many calculators that can give you an SLA time or uptime or downtime of a resource. As a rough estimate, the 99.9% could give you in a month up to 43 minutes and few seconds downtime, whereas 99.95 reduces that to roughly around 21 minutes and few seconds. Now, please don't quote me on these details exactly. Again, these are rough estimations on these. By all means, do a bit of maths or find a calculator or a document that explains some of these in more detail. Let's just jump back onto the previous slide. This is a view from the portal. We'll have a look at this in the portal on how to create one. Again, didn't want to skip that as I was talking about before. The availability set gives you a higher SLA to your resource, and again on how to configure this. So we'll go back and have a look at some of these in my setup in a minute. A couple of things I wanted to mention: that your your fault domains, you can have a maximum of 3 fault domains. And for your update domains, you can configure up to 20 update domains in your environment. Now, creating your resources in an availability set doesn't come as an added or extra cost. However, it's important to understand that when you're creating these resources, imagine if I was to create one virtual machine, I'll be paying for the cost of running one virtual machine. But in this scenario, when I'm placing multiple of these, let's assume 2 of them in 2 different fault domains and choosing different update domains between them, I am going to create 2 different resources rather than 1. So it's important to understand that the cost increases for me to have those 2 resources running as compared to 1. However, the availability set on its own doesn't come at an added cost. Now, the second option that we can look at before we jump onto the portal and try both of these options is talking about availability zones. Now, we have spoken about availability zones a few times in the course, particularly when we are talking about in module 2, looking at the core architecture of a region. Then we spoke about something similar in our storage section when we spoke about data redundancy, choosing zone redundant solutions. This is something similar to in terms of concept. We're looking at creating a resource across multiple zones in a region. Obviously, that would mean that we're looking for a region that caters for multiple zones within it. So let's assume I go and choose a region that we've been working on so far in the course. So we know for sure UK South offers me some multiple zones. And in this case, if I was to create a virtual machine and place it in multiple zones, that would simply mean that I'm now creating 2 virtual machines. But instead of having that created in a fault domain, in an update domain in my environment, that will become or give me a hardware level redundancy. What I am doing is I am now going to also create another virtual machine that will be placed completely in a different availability zone, in a complete different data center, in a complete different fault domain and update domain, giving me an entire data center failure, or redundant to complete entire data center failure. So again, nice to understand the difference. One is hardware level redundancy, the other is entire data center level redundancy. So again, gives me a bit more or higher availability in terms of creating this. As you can see on the screen, now this brings my availability to 99.99 as compared to availability set, which gives me 99.95. Like I said, roughly if you're working on hours per month, 99.95 is roughly 21 minutes and a few seconds, whereas this brings it even down to 4 minutes and 2 seconds roughly. Again, please do the maths and work out the number of hours in terms of downtime. This might be important for your services that you're working on. If I was creating a web server where I know a lot of the resources or my clients are going to land onto that web server, and an outage of half an hour could cost me in millions, maybe it's better that I come up with a better plan for that resource. An availability zone could be a much better solution where I know the downtime. And again, there can be better solutions that we can look into implementing if it is much more crucial for you to run that and have a minimum downtime. Now, these are availability options. Let's have a quick look at some of these in my portal. Let's jump onto the portal to see how we configure them. All right, we're back into the portal. So this time we're going to click on a virtual machine and let's go try create a new virtual machine. Again, I'm not going to go into details. In the first part of the session, you can watch how we configured a virtual machine. All I'm going to do is go down into picking some basic details to begin with. Call this a data server, and that's where we're starting, and leave it in UK South. Now, I have availability zones already selected for me as an availability option, as that region offers it for me. So we can start talking about availability zones. Now, it does give me an option to say choose up to 3 availability zones to put 1 virtual machine per zone. Like I said, for availability sets as well, this feature doesn't come at an added cost. However, adding multiple virtual machines increases your overall cost of the solution, so bear that in mind. Now, what I can do here to say this machine that I'm about to create, drop it in zone 1, or I can plan ahead and say let's bring that into zone 1 and 2. Right, as you can see on the screen, that it's given me an option now to create 2 different virtual machines that it will be creating simply because I've chosen 2 zones. That means it'll place 1 resource in each zone for me. Now, I can choose to say drop me a resource in zone 1, drop me a resource in zone 3. Again, it'll create me 2 resources in this scenario, or I can choose all 3 zones and create 3 different resources. Now, this is how you can configure a resource in zones, and this is your availability zones solution. However, if we were to change this and suggest that we were considering using availability sets, then I can go into choosing availability sets from in here. And as part of that, it would suggest, hey, do you have an availability set already created? And I can choose over here to create a new one if I don't have one. All I need to do is give it a name, so we can call it availability set 1. And you can see I can create up to 2-fold domains or 3-fold domains, a choice I can pick from. I can choose all the way to go up to 20 update domains if I needed to as part of this. So you have some of those options to configure. Now, bear in mind, once you're creating the availability sets, you must define what you're looking to create in this at this point. You can't typically add resources back into this once you have created this. All right, let's stop here with choosing some of the availability options. Now, the next part that we are going to look at is talk about scalability. Let's jump into the slide to have a quick conversation around that. Now, back onto my slides, looking at some of the options for scalability, 2 different terminologies that might be worthwhile discussing. Again, some of the basic cloud concepts that you would have covered in the past, talking about vertical scaling and looking at horizontal scaling. Now, the vertical scaling simply means that I'm looking at a resource type that I might want to scale up or scale down. The 2 terminologies that come along with vertical scaling, up and down. Now, the difference between them could be, let's start talking about scaling up. I have a resource that can only cater for 2 virtual CPUs, or have, let's say, 4 gig of RAM. However, it's not good enough for me. I can scale this up to, let's say, 4 virtual CPUs and 8 gig of RAM, or even higher than that. And I can keep on going. That's me scaling up. Now, if I was already, let's assume, working on something that had 8 virtual CPUs for me. Let's try that again. 8 virtual CPUs and let's say 16 gig of RAM, and I thought that was too powerful. I'm not utilizing the full potential of this machine. I could simply scale down onto something that I can use. Again, I don't need to jump in stages. I can jump down to the requirement that I have and see how that works. Now that's vertical scaling. We'll have a look at some of this in the portal just in a minute. Now the other way around would be looking at horizontal scaling. Scaling that I could think of, I have one machine running, it's not doing enough for me. I might need two instead of using one in my environment, or maybe three, or going maybe even more than that. So we can look at creating multiple of these resources. Now this is something we refer as scaling horizontally. Now in case of increasing numbers, we are scaling out. When we are reducing numbers, we are scaling back in. So that's something important to remember. Now, for us to achieve some of this, typically we are looking at solutions in the cloud called virtual machine scale sets. We can have a very quick look at some of these as part of the next demo on the portal. Right, we're back onto the portal. What we will do is go into one of the existing resources that we have. So we created App Server 3 earlier on. Now we chose a particular compute size for it already. We have 2 virtual CPUs and 8 GB RAM running onto this. Now what I can do is I can scroll down to the blade over here to start looking at some other options for me to work with. Things like I need to add different type of resources or compute. And in here I can go and choose something that's better than that in terms of space, or maybe a different series if I wanted to choose, and pick up something like 16 virtual CPUs, 64 GB RAM, so I can scale up. In this case, this is my vertical scaling, and I can hit resize on this and it will happen for me straight away. However, one thing that's very, very important to remember for IaaS solutions, in this case a virtual machine scaling up and down, there will be some downtime, because for the hardware in the back end to release and allocate new compute, it will need to stop and start again. And that is where the downtime would be added to this this change. So again, I can size up or size down, which in this case will be scaling up or scaling down. Now, apart from scaling up and scaling down, we could look at another solution in terms of horizontal scaling. And for that, we'll need to look at another solution called Virtual Machine Scale Set. Now, on the portal, we'll click on Virtual Machine Scale Sets and have a quick look at this. Now, part of this demo, I will show you how this looks like. However, we won't create a complete virtual machine scale set. By all means, you can find the documentation on how it happens, but I'll quickly explain some details that are important to understand around virtual machine scale sets. As a basic tab, we'll complete some of the details, like where it's going, what's the name of this machine. So let's call this as VM1. Again, not necessarily an amazing name to keep, but as a quick scenario, let's call this a virtual machine scale set name. We're creating in fact, let's call this VM scale set 1, and we'll leave it in UK South. Now, there are certain other options that we can touch on at this point, things like what is orchestration mode. Now, orchestration mode gives me an option to choose a flexible resource. Typically, when you're looking at virtual machine scale sets, you're going to define one machine, and you'll define a rule for the system to suggest if you're looking to manually move up or scale down, or if you're looking for a solution that does that for you automatically, which will become auto scaling. Now, typically, if you have one resource, this particular type of scenario will become your uniform orchestration mode. However, if there was a requirement for me to have 2 different types of resources, and I want both of them to scale up or scale down depending on my need, then this is where it becomes a flexible orchestration mode as part of my virtual machine scale set. As it says, it does not have to be identical anymore. It could be virtual machine types. Now let me very quickly show you some of these as a scenario. So if I keep flexible open over here and scroll down to the bottom, and I see currently I have one size selected. I can select up to 5 different sizes of the machines. So I can see, let's go and select one more and say select. And now I can see I have 2 different sizes, 2 different machines in the back end running as the main source, and then replicating again. Now, if I change that to uniform, those options disappear simply because I can only have one main machine that I'm defining and how it should look like. as and when the need increases, it will simply start scaling out. Or if I'm doing a manual scale, then I keep on going adding these into the backend as my resource. Or if I want to bring them back in again, I remove some of them. Now, if I was to do auto scaling, what we can do is we can configure some details around the auto scaling in terms of defining how should it auto scale. Again, this is where we can go into defining different solutions of what is my minimum level of auto scale. Should it start with one machine at all the time running and then scale up with 1 increments or 2 increments or 3 increments? I could have up to 1,000 machines in a virtual machine scale set, so I can plan that in here as part of my setup. However, if you look at the screen, the current setup that I have is giving me a restriction of up to a maximum 20 machines to scale up, and that's something down to the configuration that I currently have. Now, if I scroll further down, it gives me options to how it should scale out. Things like if my CPU usage is at an 80% use, again, for a period of time, then it should scale out. And if it is again at a 20% use for a period of time, then it should scale down. And I can look at creating some of these details and defining other metrics to this as well. So it's not just dependent on scale on CPUs, but we can pick some other options. In this case, I'll leave some of these details out for now. However, we can have a look at similar options in our next module when we talk about scaling in, scaling out with our app services. But for now, as a quick glance, just talking about options that are available for us to look at in terms of creating virtual machine scale sets to cover our scaling horizontally, either scaling out and scaling in based on either an automated solution, which will be auto scaling, or looking at manual solutions. Now, this brings us to the end of this module. As we conclude this module on administering Azure virtual machines, we have covered essential aspects such as compute sizes, selecting the appropriate disk storage for virtual machine workloads, provisioning Linux or Windows virtual machines in Microsoft Azure, and exploring different accessing options, including the use of Azure Bastion. Additionally, we explored configuring virtual machines availability and an introduction to Azure virtual machine scale sets. I hope you found this session informative and engaging. Feel free to check your knowledge and find additional study materials on Microsoft Learn using aka.ms/learn. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.